Malcolm X shared his beliefs and thoughts on civil rights with the world, even though his beliefs on Islam and black rights led to racial problems. Some of these problems were the Nation of Islam turning on him and protests against black rights. Malcolm X changed people's views on the oppressed groups at the time. Malcolm's beliefs are taught to the new generation of children, and his views on civil rights are followed to this day. Malcolm X was a passionate activist who fought for the rights of African Americans and Muslims. He protested nonviolently and faced many struggles. In fact, he was one of the people who helped Martin Luther King Jr. with his cause. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His mother, Louise Norton Little, was a devoted woman who was always taking care of her family of 8 children. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and a strong supporter of the black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Earl Little's civil rights activism soon brought threats from the white supremacist organization the Black Legion, a small section of the Ku Klux Klan. Even though they tried to resist the Black Legion, the Little House in Lansing, Michigan, was burned to the ground. Nearly 2 years later, Earl's body was found battered and cut lying on the town's trolley tracks, and his death was announced a suicide. His father's death caused the family to be split apart, as Malcolm and his siblings were put in separate foster homes. This experience shaped Malcolm and made him who he was later on in life. Malcolm X was thrown out of high school in 1938 and was sent to another foster home. There he went to Mason High School, where there were very few black students. Despite the difficulties he faced, Malcolm X was academically gifted and was even elected class president by his peers. In 1939, his dream of becoming a lawyer was crushed after a favorite teacher of his informed him that his dream was unrealistic, due to him being black. This resulted in Malcolm X dropping out of high school and moving back to Boston with his half-sister Ella. While Malcolm lived with his sister, he worked on the streets of Boston, which resulted in him having an acquaintance with Boston's criminal underground. This introduced him into a life of crime and selling drugs. Malcolm X was arrested for armed robbery in 1946, where he served 6 years in Charleston State Prison. During his imprisonment, Malcolm read many books, especially history, which expanded his mind and developed his ideas. Also during his imprisonment, siblings of Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam, a group of Muslims that agree with the philosophy of black nationalism. Hearing the ideas and concepts of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X converted in 1952, before his release from prison. In 1953, after Malcolm had settled into his spot in the Nation of Islam, he was promoted assistant minister of the nation's Detroit Temple. Soon after this, Malcolm was then promoted again to the minister of a temple in New York. 4 years later, he married Sister Betty X back near his home in Lansing, Michigan.
Malcolm went to Detroit after his release and became one of Elijah Muhammad's closest disciples, changing his last name to X to symbolize his lost heritage. He traveled to the Middle East and Africa in 1959. A year later, Malcolm X created a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks, which was used to advertise the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X, being a very powerful speaker, inspired black people to be proud of their race and to take back their dignity by staying away from drugs, alcohol, and gambling. He fearlessly encouraged black people to protect their families by any means necessary. His popularity grew the Nation of Islam from a small number of 400 to about 400,000 in just a few years. In 1963, a conflict between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad began over Malcolm's comments on President Kennedy's assassination, and he was ordered to be silent. Elijah Muhammad's violations of the moral code of Islam changed the way Malcolm X viewed his leader, and he was furious when he learned that Elijah Muhammad had ignored the rules in Islam and had affairs with 6 of his personal secretaries. Malcolm soon found mainstream Islam, which was very different from the Nation of Islam. In March of 1964, Malcolm developed his own organization named the Muslim Mosque, Inc. In April of that year, Malcolm traveled to Mecca for the pilgrimage of Hajj. Hajj is the journey that Muslims take to recreate the pilgrimage that the Prophet Muhammad made nearly 1,300 years ago. The journey lasts 5 days and passes by many locations in Mecca. This experience turned out to be a turning point for Malcolm.
For me, when I read the story of Malcolm and I try to get into his mind about how he would have felt when he realized that Elijah Muhammad was not the person he thought him to be, I would have been devastated personally, and I would have thought that Malcolm would have been devastated. But what that tells me about Malcolm is that he was a person of deep integrity. He was a person who practiced what he preached. And so for him to see a disconnect in someone between what they believed and then how they lived, that was deeply troubling for him. And that even though he went through that very difficult and even bitter experience, I think what it did was bring out the best of what was in him. And if you look at his life, that of course post that changing and becoming a Muslim, is that this is one of the great traits that he had. He was someone who that intimately put into practice what he believed at the very depth of his being.
When Malcolm was part of the Nation of Islam, he believed that the white man was the devil and the black man was superior to the white man. Going on Hajj completely changed his beliefs on the white man and racism. Malcolm X changed his name to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz after his pilgrimage. Malcolm wrote a letter about his experience at Hajj and how it impacted his life.
There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. You may be shocked by these words coming from me, but on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. This was not too difficult for me. Despite my firm convictions, I have been always a man who tries to face facts, to accept the reality of life as new experience and new knowledge unfolds it. I have always kept an open mind, which is necessary to the flexibility that must go hand in hand with every form of intelligent search for the truth. During the past 11 days here in the Muslim world, I have eaten from the same plate, drunk from the same glass, and slept in the same bed, while praying to the same God with the fellow Muslims, whose eyes were the bluest of the blue, whose hair was the blondest of the blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of the white. And in the words and in the actions and in the deeds of the white Muslims, I felt the same sincerity that I felt among the black African Muslims of Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana. We are all truly the same brothers. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds.
You see then that there are many white people in this country who will side with the Negro in whatever he has to do to protect himself.
But that's a considerable change of opinion in Malcolm X.
No, today I'm speaking for myself. Formerly I spoke for Elijah Muhammad. And everything I said was, Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and so. I'm speaking now from what I think, from what I have seen, from what I have analyzed, and the conclusions that I have reached.
Then the white man is no longer the devil, and he is no longer bound to be evil?
Why judge a man by his conscious behavior? I am not a racist. I don't subscribe to any of the tenets of racism.
Then there are good whites and good blacks and bad whites and blacks.
It's not a case of being good and bad, good or bad blacks and whites. It's a case of being good or bad human beings.
In February 1965, Malcolm X flew to Paris to continue the Civil Rights Act, but wasn't allowed to enter due to rumors that he was on the CIA hit list. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, while he was at a speaking engagement in Manhattan's Audubon Ballroom. He was shot multiple times by 3 armed men who intruded into the ballroom. Only one of the 3 men, Thomas Hagen, confessed to assassinating him. Witnesses contacted the police, and Malcolm was taken to the hospital on a stretcher. He was announced dead a few hours later. Malcolm X's death was a truly tragic moment in American history, and his legacy has majorly impacted the world. Malcolm grew mainstream Islam and restored dignity and pride to the black people of America, non-violently leading protests against white supremacy. Malcolm X was a remarkable figure in American history and took a stand for his beliefs. His beliefs are still taught to this day, with his legacy to never be forgotten.